Good morning. I've always wanted to do that. Good morning. It's really wonderful to see a lot of so many people here and a lot of new faces, fresh faces, for what I think is going to be an incredibly interesting panel discussion. So thank you all for being here. I'm Maria Pagan, the U.S. Ambassador to the World Trade Organization, so welcome. And I'm very pleased to introduce this panel discussion on international donor cooperation to facilitate the movement of humanitarian goods during emergencies and disasters. This is the third in a series of panel discussions designed to share experiences and highlight the challenges that WTO members, donor agencies, NGOs, and private sector stakeholders face in moving humanitarian aid and relief supplies across international borders during times of disaster. The goal of these panel discussions is to identify solutions and best practices to address those challenges. That way, the WTO and the Trade Facilitation Committee can make a positive impact on disaster preparedness, promote collaboration during disasters, and help ensure greater effectiveness of aid delivery through border procedures. It is readily apparent, sadly, that natural and other disasters are prevalent and occur at alarming frequency, often with tragic consequences on those communities impacted. The recent earthquakes in Morocco, the horrific flooding in Libya, that led to tragic loss of life are stark reminders that disaster can strike at any time and any place, and our hearts are with those who have suffered. In March 2023, the United States organized a panel to share experiences among coastal and island states. The panel included participation from Ecuador, Madagascar, Mozambique, Philippines, Tonga, Turkey, and Vanuatu, as well as from several humanitarian organizations and NGOs. Some of the key takeaways we heard were, one, the importance of having laws and regulations, including simplified customs procedures, in place prior to a disaster occurring. Two, the importance of border agency coordination and communication among relevant line ministries and with traders, humanitarian organizations, and NGOs. And three, how digitalization can be deployed to speed the flow of goods in disaster-struck areas. In June 2023, the United States organized a panel discussion to examine the specific challenges of landlocked developing countries as part of the dedicated session on transit issues of landlocked country members. We heard from Cambodia, Nepal, and Zambia, and several international organizations and NGOs. Some common themes emerged. They include, first, the importance of having a plan before disaster hits, whether in the form of a disaster management plan, standard operating procedures, or laws and regulations for emergencies. Second, the importance of communication across stakeholders. National trade facilitation committees can be a valuable interface with border agencies as information is shared internally and externally, including with neighboring countries and NGOs. Third, the importance of regional cooperation to deliver humanitarian goods quickly across regional borders. I think we can see a theme coming here, and that is key. Since then, we continue to reflect on what we heard from WTO members and other stakeholders that participated in these two sessions. In September, Canada, Chinese Taipei, the European Union, Honduras, Turkey, and the United States circulated a communication called Facilitating Humanitarian Relief in Emergency Situations, which Turkey introduced at this week's TFC meeting. We are pleased that Japan, Tonga, and the United Kingdom have joined as additional co-sponsors, and that we heard support for the proposal from a number of other delegations this week. The communication summarizes the common themes and core principles that emerged from these sessions. It was prepared with feedback and input from humanitarian organizations, NGOs, and the private sector, who all expressed great enthusiasm to continue this experience sharing with a view to identifying how the WTO and the Trade Facilitation Committee can contribute to disaster preparedness. We hope it will serve as a basis for continuing our discussions to strengthen cooperation and communication among all stakeholders involved and promote best practices. Which leads me to the focus of today. Today's panel discussion with panelists from different multilateral organizations We'll examine the role that international donors and development banks play in working with WTO members to help move humanitarian goods and supplies across international borders during times of disaster. This session is meant to complement the dedicated session on technical assistance and trade capacity building that took place yesterday in this committee. I'd like to express our sincere appreciation to our speakers today, who are joining us both in person and virtually. I'd also like to thank the Chair and WTO Secretariat for facilitating today's session. I look forward to the discussion, and I'm excited to build on our collective understanding of this topic, which has a potential for significant real-world impact. Thank you. Back to you, Alan.
Great. Thank you, Ambassador Pagan, and thank you for those introductory remarks. Good morning, colleagues. My name is Alan Treat. I'm an attaché at the U.S. mission to the WTO. It's great to see so many of you here this morning, so thank you for joining us on the tail end of a great trade facilitation week. So thank you for being here. We have a great panel this morning. And what I'm going to do is just give a quick round of introductions for our panelists who are joining us here, both virtually and in person. And then we will run through the presentations, and the panelists will really highlight the key role that the donors have working with WTO members and provide an overview of some of the programming activities, how the donors work with WTO members, the role of external stakeholders, including the private sector, civil society, and humanitarian organizations. And then we'll segue to a moderated discussion with a Q&A session where I hope to hear many of you and your feedback and perspectives on your own experiences. And then finally, we'll wrap up with a summary and some next steps. So with that, I'm going to provide a quick introduction. Today, we have joining us virtually Mr. Jamie Granados, who is the Chief Trade and Investment Division, Integration and Trade Sector of the Inter-American Development Bank. Next, we have Mr. Bill Gain to my left, who many of you know and who has participated very, very actively throughout this week. Bill is the Global Product Specialist for Trade Facilitation and Border Management at the World Bank. Next, we have Mr. Youssef Cohn, who is the Regional Integration Coordinator for West and Central Africa of the African Development Bank Group, who is joining us virtually online. Next, we have Ms. Kanya Sasrada-Poera, who is the Principal Regional Cooperation Specialist with the Asian Development Bank, also joining us online. And last but certainly not least, to my right is Mr. John David, who is the Information Systems Officer for the ASICUDA program at UNCTAD. With that, I'd like to turn to Mr. Granados from the Inter-American Development Bank to start us off. Once again, thank you.
Muy buenos días, señoras y señores.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
Muchas gracias, Alan.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alan. I will begin by sharing a presentation that I prepared for you.
Buenos días nuevamente.
Once again, good morning,
Alan,
Madam Ambassador, Alan, dear colleagues from the missions, and good morning to the Secretariat. The Inter-American Development Bank deploys a series of financial products, technical assistance, and knowledge in disasters, both before, during, and during the recovery stage. However, even before the pandemic, we had already noticed how important it is to prepare border agencies for emergency situations. And we saw, for example, the pandemic as a very exemplary case, but there may be many other types of emergencies. They can be political, there can be natural disasters, there can be cases of food insecurity. There is a great breadth of reasons why one should prepare contingency plans in order to address the arrival and border crossing of emergency goods. And it is in this spirit that under the Regional Public Goods Program, we created this program that we will now present to you. And it is actually concluding this month, and it has produced a sort of toolkit that we have now implemented in 4 countries, but the toolbox is prepared, and it can continue to serve other countries in Latin America and the Caribbean who may need it, with whom we could also work in implementing what we have now done in these initial 4 countries. Having said this, I will now present the program. As I said, we worked in 4 countries, Bahamas, Chile, Ecuador, and Honduras. But I repeat, the toolkit is now ready, and it can be transferred to any eligible country. At the Inter-American Development Bank, there are 26 such countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. And we can, of course, share some of these best practices, as we do today, with the broader international community. To develop the program, we deemed it very useful, and it was a great decision to gather support from strategic partners worldwide who work on these matters on a daily basis, not just the World Customs Organization, but also the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs at the United Nations, OSHA, and with the Global Logistic Cluster led by the World Food Program. So we didn't go at it alone. We spoke with a global knowledge base who introduced a number of best practices and up-to-date information to align our toolkit, again, with best international practices. The original goal of this operation was to develop a toolkit, again, to help the beneficiary countries to design and implement a series of standard operating procedures and contingency plans to optimize and strengthen their response capacities in the event of any type of emergency or natural disaster. Another objective was to develop the toolkit under a harmonized process of coordinated border management, aligned with international principles, with procedures and protocols that are applicable in case of emergency situations. Technical assistance was small, $550,000. The participation from countries, which often wasn't in cash but rather in kind, was around $15,000 per country. And this is done really with very modest resources, but the impact can be significant socially when the contingency, in fact, takes place. The execution took 36 months, and we are concluding it this month, as I said before. The main products that we published, and I'm going to leave you with the links. The first one is a regional toolkit available in Spanish and English to implement best coordinated border management practices during emergencies and natural disasters. You can click on this, and of course I will send you my presentation via the WTO Secretariat. You can download this document and receive more information. We also offer a virtual course in Spanish and English, so any official can self-pace through this course to understand and master the content of this toolkit. Very importantly, too, we support the implementation stage of the contingency plan and the standard operating procedures in customs administrations of the 4 beneficiary countries. of this cooperation project. And in each of these countries, we conducted an exercise, a simulation, so that we could then validate and communicate and better understand or lead to better understanding among the community who was to implement this toolkit. In this exercise, we've concluded is a best practice. So periodic drills and simulations so that all the stakeholders are up to date, are coordinated, and are aware of what they should do in the event of an emergency situation. This slide is simply a copy of part of the table of content of the toolkit to give you a rough idea of its content. It begins with a self-assessment in matters such as the legal framework, the standard operating procedures in place, also how ICTs are aligned in the event of emergencies, information flows and transparency, capacity building necessary in order to implement a toolkit of this sort. Also, lessons learned and how important it is to be able to conduct these ex post reviews to draw lessons. This is followed by a 6-step strategic approach. It includes those elements that need to be incorporated into the legal frameworks, the standard operating procedures, the digitalization support that is required, information and transparency practices, capacity building, and finally, the lessons learned. The toolkit has a little over 100 pages, and it features a wealth of content available to you, so I encourage you to take a glance. The main activities that were part of the project were first a series of regional and national workshops with international experts and members of the humanitarian community, a compilation of international instruments and good practices, which again were incorporated into the regional toolkit. We conducted a series of assessments, especially gap analysis and domestic capacity analysis on the main areas, namely the legal framework, international conventions that have been adopted, again, the main operational procedures, especially those related to the importation of critical goods such as food, spare parts, medicines, clothing, and so on in cases of emergency. Then a series of recommendations were adopted to adapt these systems and contingency plans in the beneficiary countries and the administrations of the 4 beneficiary countries. We also planned, designed, and implemented the simulation exercises, whose objective is to validate these contingency plans and then to communicate their importance. And we developed a virtual course, as I mentioned initially, to strengthen the capacity of countries before an emergency situation. In all 4 countries, we went through what I have mentioned already. And to give you an idea of what we did in each country, you could simply change the country name. This could be Ecuador, Bahamas, Chile, because the procedure was very similar. So during the first 2 years, we prepared the contingency plan and the standardized operating procedures with aid from the most relevant organizations who work with border controls. So we spoke with the Customs Agency, with emergency departments, with the International Affairs and International Cooperation Secretariat, with the Phytosanitary and Zoosanitary Control Agency, all with support from the IDB. And in all cases, we conducted simulation exercises. In the case of Honduras, we simulated a hurricane precisely to test and to put these procedures into practice with support and participation from entities such as the Red Cross, the World Food Program, as evaluators, as objective third-party observers. And in all cases, the simulations led to specific recommendations to adjust, calibrate, optimize the SOPs, and to issue recommendations for the emergency commissions in each country and do the fine-tuning, as we call it, of our procedures so that all the relevant officials could put them into practice quickly. And some of these activities have been scheduled for the next few days. We did the same thing with Chile, so I won't go into too much detail here. So the process is very similar. It starts by generating the standard operating procedures, the contingency plans, conducting the simulation exercise, and then the internalization of the recommendations that stem from this simulation. And this, of course, each exercise is enriched by lessons from previous country simulations and the experiences of international organizations.
The lessons learned are that there's a high exposure, as the ambassador said. There is a lot of room for improvement, even though there's already a lot of preparation, but there are a lot of things that can still be done in order to be prepared for contingency plans. Coordination is key. We have to keep all our knowledge on processes and rules up to date, and we need to adjust those rules to new changes and developments in regulations, in the organizational charts of countries, and so on. Everything needs to be up to date. There are also regional approaches which can be useful, not just national approaches, but regional approaches. We could harmonize all these tools and these processes on a regional basis to make it easier for goods to come in and to leave a region. And also disseminating contingency plans is very important among the public sector, the private sector, and the international assistance community. That is also key. And that's all I wanted to say. I'm at your disposal for any comments or questions you may have. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Jamie. That was a really interesting presentation. Thank you very much for that. Really interesting that you started with 4 countries, but it's available for all 26 countries within Latin America. And you mentioned, regional approaches and harmonization. So maybe this is a point we can come back to in our discussion about the potential for synergies or even the potential for spillovers amongst members. And then the interagency coordination and the stakeholder participation are pretty interesting points that I think maybe we'll come back to again. So once again, Jamie, thank you very much. Hang tight. And for the moment, we'll turn it over to Mr. Bill Gain to provide his perspectives from the World Bank. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. And good morning to everybody. Again, it's nice to be here this week, and nice to see all of our capital-based officials here to contribute. And we've had great interaction, I think, and hopefully that'll continue today. I'm just waiting for my presentation to come up. I think here it comes. Let me just check that it's working. Okay. So again, thank you, and I'd like to take you through the work that we have started, but in the Pacific Islands, to orientate the Trade Facilitation Agreement principally, and the measures of the Trade Facilitation Agreement to assist countries to prepare for emergencies, both climate-related, environmental-related, medical-related, and it's kind of where we started. So let me just there's the computers down here somewhere. Oh, there we go. The presentation outline. So I'll just start with how we began the support, and in the case study that I'll present today, which is for Tonga. And we worked very closely with Tonga on trade facilitation implementation. And so again, this was kind of one of the activities of many that we've undertaken in Tonga. Some lessons learned and next steps, and then just the broader program where this might fit in the World Bank. So, okay. Oh, okay. Right. So again, as I said, it's been undertaken in the context of trade facilitation and improving cross-border trade. As a crisis unfolds, it's critical for trade facilitation to occur. It plays a critical role in responding to those shocks and helping minimize human and economic losses, and fits in very nicely under the three kind of core areas of the trade facilitation agreement. If I can. Oh, there we go. So the major components of the emergency preparedness framework that we developed in partnership as a pilot with Tonga was to look at initially the expedited clearance of imported cargo. So as you know, it's a very specific measure under the Trade Facilitation Agreement that we began with, and were able to deepen the scope and the breadth of applying what that meant, particularly during COVID, for the initial importation of the vaccine into Tonga. And as you know, the vaccine often was a perishable commodity, particularly the Pfizer vaccine, and perishes very quickly within hours in high temperatures. And so it was particularly important to develop a whole of government approach, all border agencies to be involved, consulted, at the table, and able to participate and understand, more importantly, each other's roles. So again, very similar fashion to what we saw from our colleagues at IADB. The legislative requirements needed to be looked at, gap analysis and updates, the institutional policy reforms, and that whole of government approach to border clearance. What we found during that initial gap analysis was there wasn't a clear understanding of what every border agency did at the border or during the clearance process, particularly when it came to the Ministry of Health, that hadn't always been involved in dialogue with the private sector and dialogue with customs and biosecurity, quarantine on a day-to-day basis, and certainly not necessarily fully involved in the National Trade Facilitation Committees. And so COVID really brought that particular ministry, critical ministry, obviously, to the table and allowed for that whole of government approach. And we started it around the vaccine, so that was particularly important. And then, of course, the discussions and dialogue with the private sector was key. And what we found was that it was great when we had the National Trade Facilitation Committee government counterparts all together. They all understood it. They walked through each other's roles, and we did this walkthrough. We call it a kind of agency walkthrough. We did agency by agency and identified actually simplifications and harmonizations of processes and procedures that were kind of outside what we were doing, but that was kind of it was something that customs and biosecurity said, well, we're doing the same thing here, and maybe we can harmonize it. And so that, again, was like something that was very, very useful. But the private sector said, well, what do we do? Where do we start? Something happens. And so the communication mechanism was absolutely critical. And so we prepared the communication materials that could be socialized with all stakeholders and are available, now for everybody to access. Just try and go to the next slide. I can. So again, just to really now focus down on, the work that we did with Tonga. We started again with expedited shipments, reduced that time to import from 3 days to 3 hours because of the perishability. So it was a really nice example. And of course, it was a framework that was in place in Tonga that allowed for efficient and effective import of emergency goods just shortly after that, when the unfortunate cyclone and tsunami came through the region, and Tonga was unfortunately affected severely. But the preparedness, was something that was in place and was able to be activated. And now we're working with Tonga on lessons learned, updating the framework, and also making sure that it's really inactive again, particularly as the region itself heads into the cyclone season. The key government agencies I mentioned most before, but there's a few extra ones there: Customs, Health, Biosecurity, Animal Health, Maritime, the ports, obviously, and the airports, and the airports, the key entry point, in a time of crisis, to get those products in and out. And food safety and border security need to be maintained. It's a matter of finding that balance between their core sovereign roles, but also efficiency and effectiveness of import of emergency preparedness products and goods, medical products, and priority food products. And one of the things we saw in other countries, previously, was often there'll be huge shipments of goods that flow into a country under crisis. And often some of those products are not fit for purpose. And so, again, you have to be very careful to ensure that the SOPs and the special regime allows for instant decision-making at the time of import and export. And the regional, I think, approach is probably the most critical, particularly in the Pacific region. Very similar to the Caribbean, but in the Pacific, there's obviously some unique challenges as well. So the border agency coordination and collaboration was kind of really the key cross-cutting activity that facilitated the development of the framework and the effectiveness of the implementation of it. So lessons learnt: expedited clearance should be in place before, and I heard that from Alan and Ambassador Pagan this morning, is that it's really important to actually have this in place well before there's a disaster or emergency. Procedures need to be aligned with international guidelines, standards, and agreements, and the TFA is a key one there, amongst many, many others. Developing standard operating procedures. Again, we heard that from our colleagues at the IADB. Again, does the need to be available, can be activated quickly and effectively. And sharing of best practices across all border agencies on a continuous basis. So how does that happen? That's something that perhaps we could discuss today, is, how our lessons learned, how do we ensure there's a continuous feedback loop in place? Because you might not have to activate it for 1 or 2 or 3 years, and you need to ensure that it still remains current. And, I think over the last 2 to 3 years, we've seen a real change in the trade landscape with the supply chain resilience issues. And these are kind of cross-cutting global themes that need to inform on a continuous basis to allow for, the issues around reacting to a particular crisis. So looking ahead, more awareness raising on emergency preparedness and what it means at both the country level, but also at the regional level. And I would just like to mention that this week, in Suva in Fiji, the Forum Island trade ministers met, and they approved the regional trade facilitation strategy for the Pacific. And it is a framework that the World Bank has been working on for the last couple of years in partnership with the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat. And it allows a framework to be an agile framework in place that links all the trade facilitation activities. So the Trade Facilitation Agreement, the Regional PACER Plus Free Trade Agreement, the e-commerce and NQI initiatives, and of course, emergency preparedness across, all of the Pacific Islands. So again, it's kind of one way to think about it. We did a similar activity with CARICOM several years ago. So there is a regional trade facilitation strategy in CARICOM for the Caribbean as well. Slightly different given the context, but again, it's a way to anchor and allow for a regional implementation of a framework such as the emergency preparedness one. And of course, the agenda needs to be sit squarely with the National Trade Facilitation Committees. So the public-private dialogue is absolutely key, and that needs to be supported on an ongoing basis to ensure these continuous discussions and continuous improvement. This work that we've undertaken in Tonga, we've replicated in Tuvalu, a very small Pacific island, but not a WTO member. But again, under our work with Australia for PACER Plus, we've undertaken that work in Tuvalu. And we're in discussion with a number of other Pacific islands to replicate this program. But if there's any interest from anybody that here in the room that would like to obtain more information about it, we'd be happy to answer those. We have a 1 or 2 pager here that just gives you the facts. But it's certainly for the Pacific Islands, we'd like to roll it out, in a critical number so that we can get, a critical mass of lessons that we can not only share with the region, but also I think it would be good to get together with our colleagues at IADB and have maybe a Pacific and Caribbean lessons learned, peer-to-peer learning event, and we might look at something like that perhaps in the new year. But as I said, this work has been sitting underneath our Trade Facilitation Support Program, which is funded through our 9 donor partners, and we'd just like to say thank you to Australia, Canada, the European Union, Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, Switzerland, UK, and USAID, who was our founding donor for this program. So again, thank you very much for that. And I'm available to answer any further questions or provide more detail, and hopefully to mainstream this work into many of our trade facilitation agreement support programs in your countries. So thank you.
Thank you, Bill, for that excellent presentation. Just a couple points that popped out at me that I think we'll come back to in our discussion is how these programs and procedures or standard operating procedures, the alignment of those with the trade facilitation agreement, again, the interagency communication, private sector, bringing in the health ministry. One point I thought was really interesting, you mentioned this feedback loop, the need for a continuous feedback loop where you're putting in an upfront investment, but it might not be 2 to 3 years until you need this in place. And just to compare that with Mr. Granados's comment that modest resources really led to a significant impact. And so kind of looking at the rate of return on your upfront investment, I thought were interesting points. Maybe we can discuss a little bit more. And then finally, the peer-to-peer learning, potentially bringing together the Pacific with the Latin American region, looking at synergies and potential spillovers are also some interesting points. So thank you for those comments and perspectives, Bill. With that, I'd like to turn to Youssef Cohn, who will be joining us online from the African Development Bank to hear some of Youssef's perspectives. Over to you, Youssef. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan, for the introduction. I don't have any specific presentation, but I want to today talk about the experience of and the role of the African Development Bank in what has been the COVID-19 pandemic experience in some African contexts. So basically, you will notice that the bank has a mandate, which is to support sustainable economic development and social progress in its regional member countries. So this contributing to poverty reduction. And the bank group achieved this objective of supporting economic development by mobilizing resources and allocating resources for investments in regional member countries. And also we provide policy advice and technical assistance to support development efforts. How we operate, we have our 10-year strategy, which reflects the aspiration of the entire African continent, and it's firmly rooted in a deep understanding and experience of how far Africa has come in the last decade and where it wishes to go in the next. So we focus in terms of intervention to improve quality of African growth on inclusive growth and transition to green. Our 10-year strategy reflects the African vision transformation that is achievable. And you will notice that those who are familiar with the African Development Bank, you know that we are focusing more on infrastructure development. We are working on regional economic integration. We do private sector activities, and we also support accountability and skills and development. And these areas are far away from any specific crisis or pandemic-related activities. Though we have, in the implementation of this strategy, we pay particular attention to fragile states. We also pay attention to genders and youth, issues. My focus for as we get to the role of the bank will be on the COVID-19. The impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on Africa was unprecedented in nature and scale, and the experience of other regions facing more advanced epidemic. Africa public health system experienced severe stress in dealing with critical care needs, and the preventive measures recommended and applied profoundly impacted trade and businesses, leading to many workers, particularly those in insecure and informal employment, being unable to pursue their livelihoods and placing national social protection system under high pressures. So, in response to that, the African Development Bank quickly approved what we call a plan of 10 billion financial resources, called the COVID Response Facility, COVID-19 Rapid Response Facility, CRF. And these resources was providing to support directly countries also internally to provide rapid, flexible, and effective support to countries to mitigate the health and social economic consequences of the pandemic. So with this response facility, the objective was to help contain the spread of the virus and mitigate the impact of the pandemic on African society. And therefore, the bank adopted a package of measures, including emergency assistance to the World Health Organizations, led measures to curb the spread of the disease, and establish also particular financing. And this facility has been approved in April 2020. You just to see here that the bank reacted very rapidly and quickly. So this 10 billion of US dollar were to be deployed through rapid, cost-effective, and targeted emergency budget support to countries, and also fast-track approval processes. This meant that the bank really tried to adapt and fast-track the approval of operation internally to also provide liquidity support to regional member countries, and also to the private sectors. The immediate priorities as regard to the bank intervention was really to support health response, health capacity. We focus in this CRF on social protection of vulnerable populations and small businesses, and also we build economic resilience and recovery. So altogether, I want to just come to a key lesson from this intervention is that initially, you will know that health sector was not identified as a priority in the bank strategy and in the bank operation. And the African Development Bank had in the past very few operations in the health sectors at the start of the pandemic. However, the response that the bank approved included plan for coordination with development partners, particularly with the World Health Organization, the IMF, the World Bank, and also we partner with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees and the OCHA, the United Nations of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, just to ensure the inclusion of the most vulnerable, including women and youth and refugees in our operations. More specifically, I would like to touch on what we did for Central Africa countries as regard to the role of external stakeholders. As you know, the bank supported the CEMAC countries, four CEMAC countries particularly, based on the, we call it the low-income countries of the CEMAC zone, plus the Democratic Republic of Congo. Et maintenant, je vais continuer en français, puisqu'il s'agit d'une intervention avec votre permission, qui
if I may now switch to French.
Axée sur les pays.
This intervention in Central Africa
indiqué, les pays de la zone CEMAC et la
focused on the CEMAC countries and the Democratic Republic of Congo, as I mentioned.
Juste au début de la pandémie.
This was an emergency intervention at the start of the pandemic, through which we were able to put in place an emergency plan with the support of member states and regional bodies, the CEMAC Commission, but also a number of specialized agencies, such as the coordination body for the control of endemic diseases, and they had put in place a plan to fight against this pandemic, and the bank provided support. Given the poor state of health infrastructure, the lack of human resources, the lack of stocks of drugs and means of intervention, the bank had to intervene very quickly. And at the time that we set up this emergency project, we realized that we were missing a lot of surveillance tools in the health sector, and there was no coordination of the pandemic response in this region. And the African Development Bank therefore came in specifically to strengthen surveillance at the entry points within the framework of this emergency support to CEMAC and DRC. The objective was to have surveillance at the entry points, both land and air entry points. And then we also had to have surveillance at national level to be able to detect and manage COVID cases. We also had to provide stocks of products for both prevention and diagnosis, with coordination and collaboration amongst the member states, which was an essential aspect of this project. As I said earlier on, this is not an area of general work of the bank initially, but we were able to adapt very quickly. And through this response mechanism, right from April, we were able to intervene very quickly and bring priority support in the health sector, in the area of social services, as well as in the economy generally, as I mentioned. Lessons learned now. One important lesson that we need to recall here is that although the bank provided financing, implementation had to be based on the experience and expertise of specialized agencies in this area. We attributed the resources to CIMAC, which then paid the funds to the World Health Organization to be able to use the World Health Organization's worldwide network of suppliers and thus have access very quickly to the equipment and to the materials that were needed for the population. This was one of the major lessons that we learned from this emergency crisis situation on the continent. At the end of the operation, we noted almost 95% implementation rate, and most of the measures that were taken, as I said, benefited from the expertise of international organizations that have experience, particularly for the purchase of personal protective equipment, reagents for testing, and so on. So our conclusion with regard to the bank's support is quite satisfactory. Yes, there were some delays. Yes, there were some disruptions in supply chains, unprecedented disruptions in supply chains at the moment. But we thought that the delays would have been even worse if we had used the general system of supplies and not this accelerated emergency system. So this is what I wanted to say. The lessons that we've drawn from the bank's intervention was, first of all, that we need to work with a network of specialized partners in emergency relief, whether it's in times of pandemic or other crises, health crisis or other emergencies. You have to call on the specialized competencies and skills of these agencies. And we also need to take into account the existing national implementation capacities so that as we prepare this kind of project, we involve stakeholders as much as possible, involve the right stakeholders as much as possible. Because in the experience of Central Africa, we noted that the health ministry had not initially been involved in the project drafting, and that posed a problem of ownership when it came to implementation. It also has an impact on the sustainability of these interventions. Another lesson is the need to enhance the institutional capacities of countries as well as the regional economic communities for implementation.
À l'échelle globale afin de faciliter les achats et le mouvement de l'aide internationale. Je pense que la Banque africaine de développement est tout à fait disposée à
we are also happy to
formulation de lignes
work to draft guidelines standards at global level to help in accelerating response to crises. So, ladies and gentlemen, these are the points that I wanted to share with you, share our experience with you, and I hope that this is useful and ready to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yusuf. That was an extremely interesting presentation, really focused on the pandemic response. I thought you brought a really interesting and important dimension to the conversation when you mentioned that the bank is calling attention and focusing on fragile states, gender, and youth within the bank's broader activities. And then also really the relationship and role that the bank played working with the regional economic community within Africa, CEMAC. And then also the need to be flexible, the flexible response in the bank's lending facility, as well as the need to be adaptable and the importance of adaptability. And then finally, the point, the health sector was not involved. And another lesson learned about the importance of broader interagency coordination and stakeholder participation. And then finally, bringing in that network of partners was, I think, a really important point as well. And these are all themes, I think, that we are hearing over and over again. So thank you for drawing attention to those. And once again, thank you, Yusuf, for that presentation. Next, I'd like to turn it over to Kanya from the Asian Development Bank to provide some of her perspectives. Over to you, Kanya. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. May I ask? Thank you. I would have to ask a bit of a pardon here. My internet may not be good, so I'm just going to shut off my video if it's okay. Just to make sure that the connection is stable. So anyway, maybe I'll just go straight to the content of the presentation. But before that, let me just allow me to thank the invitation for ADB to participate in this discussion. It's always interesting to hear from other colleagues and learning from each other and see how we can all work together to prepare for these disasters and emergency. So ADB's role itself, ADB, as any other international financial institution, has always been supporting our development member countries during unfortunate disaster and emergency circumstances. We have a policy framework issued in 2004, which focuses on risk reduction, preparedness, early recovery, and reconstruction in accordance with countries' development focus. Of course, the policy framework itself being developed in 2004, it is now being reviewed, and some of the revision include emphasizing further the importance of building partnership and coordination with all stakeholders, addressing a gender dimension in building resilience and responding to disasters and emergency, applying participatory approaches, particularly through meaningful dialogue with the active participation of poor and vulnerable groups, and supporting regional cooperation, including through multi-country programs to manage transboundary disaster and emergency risks to respond to disasters and emergency. So the bank basically provides wide range of vehicles and options of modalities from financing facility, technical assistance, as well as a knowledge sharing platform. Plenty of examples that the bank has been present in this situation. Most recent example, obviously, like any other colleagues here, is the COVID vaccine initiative for developing Asia, which is a facility for vaccine procurement and logistic costs, successful distribution, delivery, and administration of vaccine. It also has building capacity in vaccine delivery, community outreach, and also surveillance. And aside from vaccine, of course, in terms of natural disasters such as earthquake and flooding, the bank have also been present, like in Nepal in 2015, Central Sulawesi in Indonesia in 2019, and Timor-Leste flooding recently in 2021, so forth. Next slide, please. So the recent COVID-19 pandemic was, I think, something new for every one of us, and yet required fast response to the need of the country. So not only the countries were stuck for a moment, not knowing how to handle such pandemic, but also for the AIDS agency itself, I think we need to admit that it was really something new. And I have to confess that the trade facilitation was only becoming a focus as part of the emergency framework when pandemic hit. So in terms of facilitating the countries, particularly on the trade facilitation aspect, we did convene a knowledge sharing seminar on custom facilitation for efficient movement of vaccine, where all customs colleagues from development member countries attended online, of course, due to the lockdown. And we did invite the representative from each region to show how they did it. For Southeast Asia, we invited colleagues from Indonesia and India for South Asia and Georgia for Central West to share their experience. And to round it, of course, we also invited the private sector representative from Global Express. So as I said, not only for the countries, it's kind of new, it's also for us in ADB. So we also issued a guidance note for developing the support to facilitate trade in vaccine and medical supplies. So basically, the guidance note aimed to build a shared framework to understand trade facilitation and border health in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. And it provides a checklist on guiding questions for our colleagues to actually drive consultation and the policy dialogue with developing member countries stakeholders, organized to identify, commission, undertake, or review trade facilitation in regional public good intervention to combat current and future pandemics. Next slide, please. So before sharing how we supported the dialogue at the level of the sub-region, allow me to just briefly share the approach that we're taking when we support the trade facilitation. We have this internal graph that says this is a trade and transport facilitation pyramid, where it basically shows that all support provided at the national, bilateral, or sub-regional level would be aligned with the commitment and principles set at the regional and multilateral level. So we do consult with WCO, with specialized international organization, as and when we support trade facilitation at sub-regional and national level. So the pyramid basically shows that the lower you go down in the pyramid, the more we focus on operations of measures and or policy. And the graph here also illustrates the support in Southeast Asia. In the case of Greater Mekong sub-region, where 5 of its members are also members of ASEAN. So we also have this red line between sub-region and regional initiatives that basically shows that while GMS or Greater Mekong sub-region is aligned with ASEAN initiative, but at the same time, the sub-region can also be introducing some initiative outside ASEAN, but can be replicated and expanded to also be applied at the regional level. Next slide, please. So this slide shows what are the initiatives undertaken by 2 of the many sub-regional groupings that ADB is supporting under the Greater Mekong sub-region, where Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Vietnam, Thailand, as well as 2 provinces of China, which is Yunnan and Guangxi, are members. The GMS issued what they called COVID-19 Responses and Recovery Plan for 2021 to 2023 with 3 pillars. Pillar 1 is protect life with one health approach, which is to ensure the health not only of people, but also of animals, crops, and food products and urban environment. Pillar 2 is protecting the vulnerable of poor by offering them opportunities in border areas and along GMS economic corridors, as well as supporting the safe and orderly movement of labor. The last pillar 3, which is, I think, more relevant to our discussion today, is to ensure that borders remain open and accelerate inclusive, green, and resilient economic activity, facilitate transport and trade, rebuild agriculture, and generate safe and seamless tourism opportunities. This plan, aligned with the pyramid explained earlier, certainly took into account also the Hanoi Plan of Action of ASEAN on strengthening ASEAN economic cooperation and supply chain connectivity in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. In terms of the implementation of this program, one of the key measures, which is to ensure border remains open, certainly was not an easy task, even as it started to open for cross-border transportation. The way each country arranged with their neighboring countries would differ. For example, some countries allow driver swap, some allows trailer swap. So the sub-region, this monitoring and exchange of information among the sub-region member has helped to at least provide clarity on the practices at the borders that could facilitate transport operators in their operational plan. Of course, ideally, it should be perhaps same or uniform, but country circumstances may differ. So transparency actually was enhanced through the sub-regional discussion. For SASEC, it has adopted an action plan, but this is more focused on the customs cooperation. The action plan is to cope with pandemic through facilitation, which will also be used as reference by member countries as guideline for future pandemics. These measures include tariff and fee payments, simplified procedures, digitalization, institutional measures, staff protocols, and other facilitative steps. Now, in drafting the action plan, we did consult WCO and also WTO. Countries also commented on some of the measures during the discussion, that they have some of them that have already done all the measures, and some needed capacity building or support to work on it. And the discussion allow us to see what are the kind of support that we could provide or offer to the countries. And it was also useful, sub-regional grouping, having a smaller number of countries, made it easier for among them to exchange information, coordinate, and learn from each other. I think earlier, before COVID, I can perhaps share also one of the example of the benefit of ensuring close cooperation between custom in the sub-region is the experience during the Nepal earthquake support back in 2015. These are the days where the electronic or digitalization was less developed compared to now. So those days, there was no regulation on goods coming from third countries. So they had difficulty in moving in goods into Nepal. But India, and those days, India's transit regulation were quite complicated with long form and requiring 8 supporting documents. And the diplomatic procedure only applies for UN goods, but then the goods coming to support the Nepal reconstruction actually came not from diplomatic channel or UN, it also comes from various NGOs and even private sector. So through the communication, India has then simplified the transit rule for earthquake support by simplifying the form into one-pager and requiring only one supporting document to be issued by Nepal Consular Office in Calcutta to certify that the goods are for earthquake purposes. And not only that, there was a waiver on bonds and guarantees requirement, and scannings were also waived, and the border was open for 24/7. And this applies for 6 months to facilitate the supply for earthquake recovery in Nepal. So that shows that the communication and regional cooperation, bilateral in this case, was really helpful in supporting or facilitating movement of goods. Next slide, please. So the impact of pandemic, lessons for trade facilitation agenda, I think this we have heard so many times. The first point and the first three points basically emphasizing on the need for digitalization. And we also feel that share the view of others in terms of there needs to be business continuity and emergency protocols before the disaster happened. And institutional mechanism at bilateral and sub-regional need to be enhanced to actually maximize the benefit of cooperation which are possible through the efficient supply chains, the possibility of resource sharing, the risk diversification, data sharing and early warnings, and capacity building, and I think political and economic stability would really also be more certain with the stronger regional cooperation. So with that, I think I'll end my presentation. I hope it meets the 7 minutes that you asked from, and it didn't go too far. Thanks, Alan.
Thanks, Kanya, for an excellent presentation. If we're on Latin America time, I think you hit the 7-minute mark, but it's okay. Thank you. That was a really great presentation. I think, again, just looking at how the Asian Development Bank is bringing the gender dimension into developing a framework, I thought was really interesting. The inclusivity aspect of bringing in, poor and vulnerable groups as stakeholders in that stakeholder participation process is interesting. The fact that you mentioned that trade facilitation really wasn't part of the planning process in the framework until the disaster struck, I found very striking. And then the support pyramid framework that kind of shows the relationship between, the trade facilitation agreement here at the WTO, working with other international organizations down to the sub-regional level and how those different levels interact with each other were very important points. The example from Nepal, very illuminating. And then the point that you made that this is not easy. It's not an easy task. And that, different borders have different implementation and practices, but the importance of monitoring and the exchange of information and the importance of transparency were very important points that I took away from your presentation. So thank you for sharing that presentation with us. I think to round out our speakers, we have John David from UNCTAD, who has a very interesting presentation to give a slightly different angle on some of the IT solutions that UNCTAD has developed to address disaster preparedness. Over to you, John.
Thank you very much, Alan. Good morning to everybody. And I'd like to thank the organizers of this session for allowing the UNCTAD ASYCUDA program to participate and to deliver this presentation this morning. It's also very good to see many countries here which use ASYCUDA, some long-standing friends of ours. So you're probably wondering why the ASYCUDA program is in this session and what is the relationship to disaster preparedness and the world of humanitarian aid. Well, I will explain it to you. Of course, our mandate is customs and customs automation. However, back in about 2014, we were contacted by UN OCHA, Humanitarian Affairs, who obviously are the business experts when it comes to humanitarian assistance in the United Nations. And they came to us because we deal with customs and that of between 90 to 100 countries are using ASYCUDA. And they exposed to us some of the issues that are going on in humanitarian aid related to customs. It became very clear that customs was often being blamed to be a bottleneck during emergencies, that there was a lack of communication, obviously a lack of predictability, and therefore, how could we address this from a customs automation point of view? So over the years, as you can see, this is the context of how the ASYCUDA program got involved, is that we decided to build a module in part of the customs IT system called ASYREC, and to facilitate various phases of emergency process. So we identified globally 3 phases to the process. The first is the one that we're discussing today, the pre-emergency and preparedness stage. At this stage, what we try and identify is what and who. So who should benefit from facilitated procedures during times of emergency, and for what goods? So we always talk about what and who. Now, one of the issues about emergency response and preparedness is that we have no idea when it's going to happen. And two, like when we're at school and university and we study, we leave everything to the last minute. So, okay, I did, maybe you didn't, but the idea is that you need to be prepared and repeatedly prepared. So like a fire drill, it has to be repeated before we understand what to do. And the preparedness phase is an ongoing, permanent phase. And it also continues in phase 2 as well. And phase 2 being the actual declaration of emergency and responding. Phase 3 is, of course, termination and post-emergency. But the preparedness phase, which we are discussing today, is critical, but it also continues into phase 2. And in phase 2, we continue to identify who should benefit from facilitated procedures and what for what products. However, this is not just a simple exercise because there are so many different actors involved. And those actors need to be in some coordinated manner working together and repeatedly. So some of the actors identified on the right-hand side, obviously customs in this case, National Disaster Management Agency, sometimes called NDMA, sometimes NDMO for organization, and of course all the PGAs, the partner governmental agencies. So in the preparedness phase, specifically, we look at needs assessment and immediate response. At customs level, procedures and simplifications assessment. So customs procedures related directly to emergency response need to be defined beforehand, defined and communicated to the rest of the community so that they know what to do and when. It was earlier mentioned by some of the other speakers about international standards. Well, there are a lot of them out there. There's the Istanbul Convention, revised Kyoto Convention. There are many different standards defined by many different agencies, including the World Customs Organization, which relate to these situations and should be taken into consideration. Also involved in this phase is that the NDMO records the cyclone emergency. Early warning, automatic notification of stakeholders needs to be set up beforehand. And in the long term, and we should aim for this, is interoperability between customs and other NGO and humanitarian community systems which are available. This is also related to the post-emergency when statistics, stock management all become very, very important in order to be able to respond to any future emergencies. And the key point at the end is, of course, the who factor, who. So all the people that are going to be involved in those facilitated procedures must register beforehand and during the emergency. But the more that's done before, the easier it becomes during. Of course, we're talking about an IT system, so data, very important. It's also not just the fact that we're going to enter data about what goods and who's going to do it, but also communicating information publicly to the trading community and the humanitarian community. Simple things like, what time are the customs offices open? Where are they? Where can you declare your goods? Where can you declare your goods with facilitated procedures? It might seem simple to have a website for that, but it's important. Information about anticipated emergency and relief items, so that's the what, and using past disasters as a feedback for future and to learn from the experience of the past. So I mentioned before, one of the very sort of difficult aspects that was identified by some of the partners that we worked with is the coordination factor and grouping all the actors together. We did a simulation exercise in Nepal in 2017, based on the earthquake that had happened beforehand. And we had participants from customs, from NDMO, from private sector, and from governmental agencies, giving their experience of what had happened. And there seemed to be a duplication of work being done across various actors, but there also happened to be a lack of knowledge. So people don't know what the customs procedures are or were or should be. They don't know what documentation they have to provide in support of their declarations. They don't know what process and procedure to use. So it was all very well having done the exercise in 2017. A lot of people learned a lot and they knew what to do. But unfortunately, that exercise, well, at least as far as our participation was kind of not been repeated that often. And this is where repetition is required. So in terms of the ASIREC module that we have developed, one of the important factors about it is that it's cloud-based, SaaS, software as a service. So if the infrastructure has been damaged during an emergency, the only requirement is an internet connection to connect to the cloud to be able to use the module. And ASIREC, our first project in implementation is in Vanuatu. This is ongoing as we speak. And we are going to proceed to some of the training and some of the awareness seminars in Vanuatu to implement ASIREC. And in the long term, in the Pacific region, we also have a project funded by the UN Development Account for awareness in the Pacific region. And the aim of this project, or one of the aims of this project, is for Vanuatu to be a case study for the other countries in the Pacific regions to participate and learn from their experience, which we are currently doing, and that they are currently gaining. So thank you very much for that, and I'm open to any questions and queries that you might have. Over to you, Alan.
Great, thank you, John. Thank you for that presentation. It's a really kind of interesting angle to come in to kind of look at how IT systems and IT solutions can help support, facilitating trade in disaster situation, and really the role of technology as well. The cloud-based systems and the digitalization, I think, are a lot of the same themes we're hearing over this week. I'm thinking in the back of my head, our Chinese colleagues have this really interesting communication out in the Trade Facilitation Committee. Might be worth talking to them a little bit more. Just a couple points that I thought was really interesting. Again, the notion that preparedness is an ongoing thing. Bill had mentioned this continuous feedback loop, how it takes a couple years to get things and really tie it into, this upfront investment that you have to make that might have a payout or a rate of return that's a longer time horizon. And so taking into account the resources needed to develop these kind of systems and the partnerships with your development partners. And then finally, again, the coordination aspect. I think, the Vanuatu pilot, the case study, I know we have some folks in the room from Vanuatu, and I think we'd very much welcome any feedback or perspectives and experience sharing that you have, maybe when we get a little bit later in our agenda. And so with that, I think that concludes our presentation segment of the program. And maybe just to move into a moderated discussion, maybe I could just start with one question. And Jamie, I'm going to maybe start with you and then open it up to our other panelists. Throughout the week, we've been hearing about various member perspectives about, well, how do we find the technical assistance and capacity building that we need? To kind of quote a famous American film called The Ghostbusters, who do you call, right? Who do I call? Who is the person that I need to get in touch with? What is that process? And so, Jamie, maybe you can walk us through the process that the Inter-American Development Bank took to partner with the Bahamas and Chile and Ecuador and Honduras about kind of if you could just walk us through that and describe to us how you came to partner with those countries. Thank you. Over to you, Jamie.
Gracias, Alan. Por supuesto. En primer
Thank you
lugar,
very much. Yes, of course. First of
quiero
all,
señalar que el Banco Interamericano
I'd like to say that the
tiene
IDB
oficinas en todas las
has
capitales
offices
de los 26 países
in all
miembros
26
de los
capitals of our member countries.
de tal manera que el acceso al banco es relativamente fácil.
It's relatively easy
Sencillamente,
to access the bank.
de contactar a la oficina local del Banco
People need to get in
Interamericano.
touch with the local office of the
Empieza un
IDB.
diálogo sobre cómo
That's how
acercarse al banco,
a conversation starts
tiene el banco,
on how the bank can help, what kind of instruments we have, what kind of technical cooperation we can provide, knowledge, and so on.
Sin embargo, en el caso de
However,
el programa de bienes públicos regionales,
this regional public goods program,
identificar aduanas con las cuales hemos trabajado de cerca en el
we've
pasado,
worked closely with customs
hacer una selección
agencies.
geográficamente
We had
representativa,
already worked with them in the past.
ofrecerles la posibilidad de desarrollar un toolkit y un plan de
Give them
contingencias
the
y empezar a
chance to
trabajar con
develop a
ellos.
toolkit and a contingency plan, and we start to work.
La limitación de recursos fue en última instancia lo que determinó que solo pudiéramos
resources were
países.
scarce, meaning that we were only able to work with 4 countries. But
habilitar un toolkit genérico para
we developed a generic toolkit which could be replicated in any other country.
Que cualquier otro país,
so any other country,
4 que ya señalé, que tenga
in addition to the 4 countries I spoke about,
toolkit,
any other country who may be interested in implementing the toolkit can get in touch with me or their local office in the capital city, and we can discuss the kind of program that we could implement in 2024. We're open to any request
de los miembros del banco y consecuentemente le daremos consideración, programación y fondeo en función de la solicitud y de las
request, and we will provide funds according to our possibilities. Thank you.
Thanks, Jamie, for that. So it's a question of come knock on our door in our regional offices. Might be one avenue. It sounds like there's an ongoing relationships with Customs Authority and the IADB is another avenue. Maybe, Kanya, I can kind of ask you the similar question from the Asian Development Bank's perspective, given that the work that you've done at a sub-regional level that involves a lot of different members. Maybe you can just share a little bit of your experience of how you went about choosing the members that you ultimately worked with within the context at the sub-regional level.
Well, thanks, Alan. Basically, in terms of financing facility, of course, it's done at the national level, and similar to Inter-American, they just need to knock on our country representative office in that country. And if it's a disaster like earthquake, even the office would feel it, so they would knock on each other's door, I guess, offering on how they can help. But for the trade facilitation, of course, as all of us discussed, I think the enhancing the preparedness is an ongoing thing. And through the sub-regional custom committees, we are working closely with the customs colleagues, and some gap assessment on this dialogue also on what needs to be done to build their capacity is ongoing. So as and when, knock on wood, the disaster come, we would already have a good dialogue and relations with customs, and to implement the project as designed and as needed. I hope that answers the question.
Great, thanks, Kanya. And maybe, turning to Youssef from the African Development Bank Group, given, I think, in the COVID context, the work with CMAC and at the regional economic community level, can you talk a little bit about how you forged that relationship or how this program developed with CMAC and its member states?
Oui, merci.
Thank you.
Alors, globalement, cette approche a été basée un peu à la demande.
This was more or less based on demand. The idea was that
pour les autres partenaires également, ce sont des interventions
operations similar to other partners. These interventions are part of an approach which is based on the demand requests on the part of beneficiaries. And we often have missions that go out to identify needs on the ground, but where emergency operations are concerned, it is very often the countries themselves that request the direct intervention of the bank based on an emergency plan that they have often already drafted. And that is why I was saying earlier on that there has to be a good understanding at the national level amongst the various partners and stakeholders so that they are able to identify their priorities and identify what measures need to be implemented. And in the case of CEMAC, they came to see us with a sub-regional plan that had already been drafted under the leadership of the Ministers of Health, and where the coordination was already in place. I think the contribution of the bank then was by providing the funding with a certain level of flexibility. And we were also able to provide some advice because initially the plan did not include implementation involving external agencies such as the WHO. The plan only provided for implementation by the countries themselves using the funding from the bank. But with the MOUs that we have with certain specialized agencies, UN agencies, and in particular the WHO, our experience from the Ebola crisis, for example, the Ebola crisis in the West Africa, led us to realize that it was important to have this external partner involve the WHO. And so we gave that advice to the member states that they should work with our partners in WHO. And that idea was accepted by CEMAC and its member states. And so that was done in terms of implementation, monitoring of the purchasing processes, and so on. So this is generally, these things are done on the demand or request of the countries. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Youssef. And a good point about the assistance and the demand-driven nature of looking for the assistance. It sounds like beyond just knocking on your door, there are a couple of steps, maybe 3 or 4 steps that members, CMAC members took in the pandemic context to utilize the bank's resources. They had a plan. The priorities had already been self-identified, and the plan had been drafted. And so it was really coming to the bank with the plan in place, and then working together, to include the advice and collaboration with some of the external stakeholders. Interesting point. Maybe I can turn and ask Bill a similar question, given your footprint in the Pacific region. Beyond simply knocking on your door at a local branch, can you maybe walk us through and describe, what are maybe 3 or 4 steps that members need to take to utilize your resources to prepare for a disaster?
Thank you, Alan. And again, similar to our colleagues in the regional banks, we do have a country office in many countries. And so accessing support, via that mechanism is one way. The work that we undertook, particularly around this emergency preparedness, was in the context of the full and effective implementation of the Trade Facilitation Agreement. And so that context kind of just changed things a little bit. It allowed for countries to access support, through the mechanisms that we have in place for Trade Facilitation Agreement support, and that includes the WTO. Countries can, contact TFAF and seek, support, for their C categories. And of course, expedited shipments is kind of the starting point for developing special regimes. So that's one thing. And when a country seeks support from the World Bank, there's 2 or 3 steps that we like to see in place. One is a leadership mechanism in place, so that the National Trade Facilitation Committee kind of fulfills that criteria. And if there isn't one, then that would be the first thing that we would work with the country to design, implement and sustain over time, because as we know, the sustainability of NTFCs is not an easy task. And again, when there's a crisis, that's the mechanism that needs to be activated quickly, effectively and efficiently. The second step that we would like to see is at least some commitment to reform, some high level, whole of government commitment to wanting to implement, an efficient and effective cross-border clearance process, which can be activated, for many reasons, but particularly in a time of crisis. And one of the things which I didn't mention earlier, but it came to me very quickly when we heard the Azakuta presentation, is often there's no internet. And so what do you do? In Tonga, the cable was cut. And in fact, they had no access to internet connectivity, except from some very small satellite capability, for many weeks. So again, sometimes reverting to a manual process that replicates the automated process in a time of crisis is the only way you're going to allow for, the efficient and effective importation of emergency provisions. And, we heard from the Asian Development Bank that during the earthquake in Nepal, they just opened the border because there was no other way. And so again, I think, there's a number of things to be considered in the time of crisis. And, community protection and sovereign ability to intervene, they're all very important. But I think probably the most important is actually integrating into the disaster response, at the strategic level, So it's not just about cross-border trade. I mean, that's going to be critical because the provisions, medical supplies, vaccines need to come across quickly. However, it does need to be, part of the broader whole of upstream government decision-making at cabinet level around, how the components all fit to allow a response in real time. So again, but certainly those 2 or 3 steps we like to see, obviously demand-driven, a letter of request is always, good to in the time, in advance, before a crisis, but at time of crisis, any response to the bank will be followed up with very quickly. And just the final point is that we are trying to mainstream this work into our development policy operations as prior action. And so it's something we can work on in advance. It then triggers, the tranche of funds for budget support for many countries. And it's now a core activity we're including in our climate and environmental related development policy operations as a prior action. We just concluded this in Tuvalu, and I think it went to our board last week for approval. And so again, it's a really nice example of how it informs, the hundreds of millions of dollars that could be provided for countries in the time of crisis or in response to crisis activity. Perhaps I'll leave it there. Thank you, Alan.
Great. Thanks for that response, John. And some of these do sound like the 5 C's that been hearing you, describe kind of throughout the week, particularly on the leadership and the commitment to reform. And maybe turning to you, John, you're in a little bit of a different place, given that the IT system, the ASIREC module, is really focused on Vanuatu, and it's a pilot project, and you're really at the beginning of this process. And so I think it'd be interesting if you could maybe walk us through that relationship with Vanuatu. Obviously, we have Vanuatu in the room, so we'll see if you're telling the truth or not. But it would be really interesting if you could walk us through kind of that relationship and how that began.
Yes, I'll be careful what I say. Vanuatu, we benefit from the fact that we have been with them for many, many years. I think it's more than 20 years, maybe, in terms of customs automation, electronic single window, and now more recently, maritime pre-arrival. So we have a very good relationship with them, but it's also, unfortunately, the increase of natural disasters in the region has also pushed the need for such activities. I think a bit like what the banks were saying, but in a different context, we respond to requests from governments for technical assistance. And in the case of ASIREC or a module to facilitate the emergency phase, the request is not the problem. It's more a problem of how do you justify funding, even if it's government funding or external funding, for something where the tangible results might not be visible for a while. So one of the issues that we've had and some of the ASICUDA countries have had is that you say we're going to invest, we're looking for funding for preparedness, emergency response, and possibly post-emergency. Well, yes, you can, the preparedness is, like I said, it's a permanent state. But how do you measure those results to justify a project and therefore the funding of a project, especially if the disaster doesn't happen for 1 or 2, 3 years? That's been an issue that we've had. I think in the case of Vanuatu, what's happened is that with the progress of customs automation, electronic single window, more recently postal management express, and there's been like a natural progression to also with the natural progression to therefore have a desire to implement ASIREC and something to assist in emergencies. And therefore, it's sort of come as a progression of that. In other countries, we've setting up like a pilot of ASIREC just for observation for Afghanistan in the Disaster Recovery Center, which is based in Valencia. But as such, it's part of a wider project with many different activities. It's not specifically for emergency relief consignments. So although, yes, we do respond to technical assistance requests, the request is not really the issue. It's more the sort of how do you justify funding for something which is very difficult to measure, which doesn't necessarily increase customs revenue, which doesn't necessarily, show a nice graph of increase or decrease in clearance times. And post-emergency, in many countries, Nepal and other countries where we've seen, or Haiti, where we've seen natural disasters, there's always a response post-emergency. Let's do something. But then priorities change in all countries, in all walks of life. And therefore, it's difficult to sort of get that going again while, let's say, nothing bad is happening. So I think Vanuatu is a good example, but it's not always like that, unfortunately, and due to these sort of challenges that everybody has at that time.
Thanks, John. I mean, it sounds like a really interesting point about kind of investment time horizons and about trying to justify to your taxpayers about the investment you're asking them to make when it's a little bit uncertain when those resources would need to be deployed. And it's a great example you give on that issue. Maybe we can stop here and invite members that are in the room to, particularly, I don't want to call you out, but I am gonna call you out, actually. We are fortunate enough to have customs officials from Vanuatu, Ecuador, and I'm looking at you, Chile as well. And so I think we would very much like to take advantage of your presence here to hear your perspectives. And so maybe I see Vanuatu's flag up. Maybe we can start with Vanuatu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair or moderator. I don't know how you address the titles, but...
You can call me Alan.
Okay. Thank you. I think on the outset, Vanuatu would like to take this opportunity to, first of all, thank the U.S. for organizing this panel discussion on international donor cooperation to facilitate movement of humanitarian goods during emergencies and disasters. Vanuatu notes that it is the third panel, and for that we want to acknowledge all stakeholders and partners involved in this topic under the ambits of the Trade Facilitation Agreement. Vanuatu is amongst all the other Pacific Island countries who are vulnerable to natural disasters such as cyclones, volcanic eruptions, landslides, tsunamis, earthquakes, and global pandemics such as COVID-19. So any regional program in disaster response and preparedness for the Pacific is always fully supported. Disaster preparedness is amongst the top priorities for Vanuatu. Therefore, any donor partner support in this regard is very much welcome. On the flip side, this not only enables our compliance under our categories of commitments, but directly address the adaptation and mitigation measures of climate change impacts in our region. So the average cost of damage per Category 5 cyclone in Vanuatu is normally around 30 billion fatu, which is equivalent to $250 million. Responding to this magnitude of damage, it normally takes several months before humanitarian relief supplies get to reach most affected areas. Time delay and proper logistics planning is amongst the lessons learned from the past response experiences. Although response has improved over the recent cyclones, COVID-19 pandemic has yet again changed the landscape of how response operations are done. This was the experience with Cyclone Harold in 2020. So Vanuatu is thankful for the collaboration between United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNDAD, and Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, of the UN Secretariat, OCHA, to have this ASIREC module developed. We also thank Australia for funding support in this development and rollout phase in Vanuatu. Vanuatu has a very long experience with Asikuta and is happy that UNDAT has identified Vanuatu to pilot this module. In Vanuatu, the name Asikuta is now commonly known as single window because of the features and functions it now offers. We believe this can assist us to improve disaster response and also disaster preparedness, even outside of disaster periods. We have launched the project back in May this year. It's part of our single window phase 3, as alluded to yesterday. And we are looking forward for the close cooperation amongst donors and partners to get the module implemented in Vanuatu. On a regional level, we acknowledge the World Bank on the regional program in the Pacific, and we also note the presentation made yesterday at the committee meeting to consider further collaboration and cooperation on a regional level to support implementation on specific articles of the TFA. Because when it comes to natural disasters such as cyclones, earthquakes, and tidal waves, tsunami, there is no border amongst the islands in our region. A good suggestion made yesterday is the regional dialogue between trade facilitation steering committees. This is something regional programs can help facilitate to strengthen cooperation on regional level. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much for sharing your perspectives, Harold from Vanuatu, head of Vanuatu Customs. I'd like to turn it over to Ecuador.
Muchas gracias, Alan.
Thank you very much, Alan. And first of all, I would like to mention that I am speaking on behalf of my country. First, I'd like to express Ecuador's gratitude to the United States for organizing this panel. For Ecuador, this is a priority in principle, and particularly given our geographical location, Ecuador is exposed to natural disasters, including earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and in fact, we are in the preparation stage to face the impacts of the El Niño phenomenon. Ecuador, as a beneficiary of the IDB project that we have learned about this morning, is assessing the toolkit, and our customs service sees it as very useful to face healthcare emergencies and natural disasters. And I'd like to underscore the IDB cooperation, both as part of trade facilitation as in other areas. And I'm very pleased to see Jaime here today. We feel that one of the key elements is interagency coordination. And in situations of relative calm is already a challenge, and more so during emergencies. So keeping this in mind, I'd like to take this opportunity to ask a question to all of the presenters, which is this. In this room, we have a number of capital-based delegates who work in their national trade facilitation committees. My question would be to ask you to offer us more detail on the role of national trade facilitation committees, because we understand, and I've heard about this focus on customs agencies specifically. However, we have interagency committees, the TF committees in each of our countries, so I think it'd be useful to hear more about what their role is. Remembering also that these committees must coordinate with national emergency plans. These are not isolated actions. In the case of Ecuador, we have a risk management plan, and in the event of an emergency, this emergency operations committee is activated, and the head of state, the president, heads this emergency committee. Committee. So my next question would be, how can the Trade Facilitation Committee interact with these emergency committees that are activated to react to this type of situation? One of the lessons learned by the COVID pandemic was that the National Committee can broadcast and disseminate information. For instance, during an emergency, you only have a few hours to activate certain procedures and certain articles. And as you've said, these are not procedures that are used on a daily basis. So communication is key. And that was something that the Trade Facilitation Committee was able to do, because it does exchange information between the public and the private sector. So as a communication channel, it's very useful. If it receives information directly from the Emergency Operations Committee, it itself can disseminate that information, because, as you know, during an emergency, every minute counts. So I think that we should take a better look at the role of these national committees, not as isolated institutions, but what the committee would do in these cases. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. Excellent questions. Maybe before turning to our panelists to respond to your questions, I can invite Chile to provide any perspectives.
Thank
you very much, Chair. And just as Ecuador, we thank you for inviting us to participate. And I am not a customs official, just to clarify. I come from the Foreign Relations Ministry, from the International Economic Relations Secretariat, where we oversee trade facilitation. And we are the division in charge of the National Trade Facilitation Committee. So I should begin by following up on Carlos's question and say that we were not a part of this, or rather, the exercise that we participated in. We didn't do it as the Trade Facilitation Committee per se, but rather the Trade Facilitation Area, which is part of our division, participated in that exercise. So we've done it step by step. By linking with other areas, including the Trade Facilitation Committee. And so even though we already have a decree and a law, and we have other members of the government who participate in this committee formally, as well as the private sector, we did have to make adjustments to our participation. Now, we are the coordinators, so we don't create, we don't draft the solutions, but we coordinate. And we knew that these various bodies existed, such as the Maritime Transportation Facilitation Committee, the Air Transport Facilitation Committee. All of these bodies existed, but they were disjointed. So we stepped in as a coordination venue, and that was my role. I coordinated the Foreign Relations Ministry that has an emergency response office. Now, having set the stage, I want to say two things. One has to do with the change of vision from one of reacting to one of prevention. So we used to have a body called the National
Servicio Nacional de Prevención, no, la Oficina Nacional de Emergencia.
The National Emergency Office, whose law dated back to 1974. Later in 2021, this law was amended, and the office was now called the National Disaster Prevention and Response. And you can see the change of vision, because we used to have a body, but it was only to respond rather than to prevent. So this project with the IDB fits in very nicely, and it was very interesting. It allowed us to look at the most important thing, which is interagency coordination, because many agencies participate at various levels. So it's important to establish participation in various aspects, such as contingency and various stages of a disaster as it unfolds. So I think this has been a very positive experience. And even though the National Disaster Prevention Service contains a number of bodies, or rather participants from other agencies, there are many others that can be contacted, and that's what we saw during the exercise. We saw, perhaps we're missing communicating with such and such agency, and they should be included in this exercise. So I believe that, and just this past August, in fact, we had an earthquake drill, because we are, just as Ecuador, we are an earthquake-prone country. We have volcano risks as well. We have recently suffered great losses due to torrential rains. So the prevention perspective has been enlightening, and we have work to do. And it's interesting to see how we are granting the trade facilitation committees with links to all these other bodies where we can participate actively and coordinate. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for sharing those experiences from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, not from Customs. My mistake. Really interesting point that it wasn't the National Trade Facilitation Committee, but there is a coordinating aspect in through the MFA, working on the emergency with the Emergency Response Office. Maybe Jamie, I could turn it over to you. The questions that Carlos had is the question is, can you offer more detail about the role of the National Trade Facilitation Committee, and how can the National Trade Facilitation Committee interact and work with the emergency committees in member countries? Maybe, Jamie, I turn it over to you for any reflections.
Gracias, Alan, por supuesto.
Thank you, Alan, of course.
Y mucho gusto saludar a Carlos desde la distancia.
And a warm greeting to Carlos from afar. We've worked many, many times together.
De cualquier intervención.
So the philosophy underlying any intervention related to emergency planning and contingency planning and structuring our work with, of course, the oversight bodies and customs is a customs or trade facilitation lens. So how do you move goods quickly and send them where they are needed to respond to the disaster? So we see a clear parallel between the trade facilitation agreement and the philosophy that informs the trade facilitation committees at the national level and all the work related to contingency planning and response. So there's also a clear overlap between the governance structure associated to these two topics, because, of course, the customs agency is one of the main partners in setting up contingency plans, in addition to other agencies for emergency response within a given country. So, yes, our work is the same, and they interlink in multiple places. So I think they speak the same language. Now, if you go over the toolkit that we have prepared, in fact, you will find many references to the Trade Facilitation Agreement because it spells out a number of principles that inform any emergency response, including interagency coordination, including the use of IT systems and the possibility of having advanced declarations, and all the principles that inform the Trade Facilitation Agreement are also relevant to what we wish to promote in terms of contingency planning for disaster response and other emergency response. So perhaps right now in the toolkit and in the work that many of us are still doing, there isn't an explicit reference to the National Trade Facilitation Committee or Council. So it may be necessary to make that explicit link now that you mentioned it. However, in practice, it is the same bodies, they have the same philosophy, they're informed by the same principles. So perhaps in addition to our homework, which is to make that link more explicit, I feel that we are already most of the way there because there is an implicit link between these instruments and this committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie, for that response. Noting there's a clear parallel between the National Trade Facilitation Committee and the overlaps in the governance structure. Kanya, maybe I can turn to you with a similar question. If you could maybe speak a little bit about the role that the National Trade Facilitation Committee plays within this support pyramid framework, maybe the interaction, if there is any, between the national and sub-regional level.
Yes, thanks, Alan. In the case of the Greater Mekong sub-region, actually, the one that plays quite a bigger role is the National Transport Facilitation Committee at each of the country, more because the focus is on the land-based border. But of course, customs is part of the National Transport Facilitation Committee, and GMS itself has recently established the Trade and Investment Task Force, which actually also is the representative of National Trade Facilitation Committee. So the link between the National Transport Facilitation and National Trade Facilitation is becoming stronger in the GMS context. In terms of SASEC, the South Asian Sub-Regional Economic Cooperation, yes, it's true that the action plan that was established is really much focused on customs, but this within the institutional setup of SASEC itself, the customs subgroup report to Trade Facilitation Committee, which is the representative of NTFC of a country, and the program also have provided national expert in each of the country that would help coordinate what has been decided at the sub-regional level with the respective National Trade Facilitation Committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Kanya, for that response. Maybe Youssef, I could ask you kind of a similar question that Ecuador asked. Is there a role? What is the role of NFTCs now in the CMAC context? Can you talk a little bit about any interaction that CMAC and the African Development Bank had with the National Trade Facilitation Committee?
Oui, merci. Merci beaucoup, Alan.
Yes, thank you.
Effectivement, cela nous donne l'occasion et je voudrais vous remercier.
Yes, this is an opportunity, actually, and I'd like to thank you for it. To speak beyond the health issues I mentioned in my presentation, to speak about what the bank does in terms of facilitating trade and facilitating transport. As you know, our development bank has a comparative advantage in terms of our support to fill the gaps in infrastructure There are flagship projects to facilitate transport through corridors. This year, for example, we're working on building a corridor between Equatorial Guinea and Gabon. There's also a corridor linking up Central African Republic and Chad. Now, you mentioned NTFCs. In 2018-2019, we adopted a project to implement the TFA. And through this project, the bank funded the implementation of the national committees. So we helped member countries there, of the CMAC and in the DRC. We supported the implementation of those committees and the implementation of regional committees. The bank's support also helped draft a regional plan comprised of activities for standardizing procedures, including for transport and customs exchange. For example, for small border businesses which sometimes operate informally. So we're trying to strengthen those activities and to learn from it. This would help increase the impact in the second phase. We're currently preparing that second phase for NTFCs. So we're considering the possibility of integrating early warning mechanisms. In the current structure of our support, we hadn't integrated the possibility of crises, health crises, humanitarian crises, security crises. It hadn't been factored in sufficiently. And we realized that countries didn't have enough response capacities. So this requires working upstream to prepare through warning mechanisms, among others, and working on prevention. You know, today there's a combination of shocks in the Chad Lake Basin, or with climate change that's generating population displacement. This leads to humanitarian crises with refugees, and we're drafting plans, but we need to help countries prepare. And to factor in emergencies in order to have a preventive approach. Those guidelines need to be implemented, and instruments like the TFA need to be implemented in that way. We need an approach that would effectively facilitate the movement in the CMAC space, among others. Thank you, Alan, for giving me this opportunity to tell you a little bit about the bank side. And in the CMAC region, just know that we've also set up a tool for transport and trade facilitation. And that instrument needs to be revised as well, needs to be updated. And we will do so in the light of what came up during this session, to have an adequate toolkit. Thank you.
Thank you, Youssef, very much for describing some of the funding activities the bank had undertaken to fund both the national and regional national trade facilitation committees. Really, I think a really important point you made about the focus on more the smaller traders at the border, some of the informal economy activity taking place amongst small-scale traders. And then your point, that, crises hadn't been integrated, and maybe the need to integrate those activities very much in line with our colleague from Chile's comment about the need to change the vision, at least that's the translation in English, and to going from more of a reactive to a preventative posture. A really interesting point. So thank you for that, Youssef. Maybe turning to Bill for any reactions to Ecuador's question before moving to a wrap up.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you, Ecuador, for that question. And I had alluded to the criticality of the National Trade Facilitation Committees during my presentation. Firstly, I think every country is a little bit different, and I think it's about finding the mechanism that actually works efficiently and effectively. But the upstream committee, which might be at the strategic level and is going to be coordinating a national emergency response, needs to rely on certain structures beneath it. And the National Trade Facilitation Committee is one that can help with the preparedness in advance. They are the ones with, a consistent dialogue with the private sector and with those, private sector traders that are going to be bringing in emergency provisions. It's not just the international community, but there's going to be a private sector component here. And having that dialogue, automatically in place really does help. I think, less obvious, but certainly of a huge benefit is, the framework around the Trade Facilitation Agreement in Article 8, that border agency coordination framework, which needs to be activated. And if it's already been implemented, it sits with the National Trade Facilitation Committee. Everybody kind of knows what their role is and how they can contribute, through that leadership of the National Trade Facilitation Committee. I mentioned during my presentation one of the benefits that we've seen during the COVID response was actually the mainstreaming of the Ministry of Health into National Trade Facilitation Committees and the public-private dialogue. And it was missing before. So again, I think that, that bodes well for the future. But again, it's, we set up these structures and then they don't get activated for several years. So things can become stale. And we can, I think, learn lessons from the experience of countries where there's been some sort of crisis or disaster. And look, we saw that in Tonga. The first thing they did was set up an operations centre and activated the border agency working group very quickly because it was in place. And so that kind of made a difference. I just want to also connect back to Vanuatu. Thank you for updating us on the approach, particularly at the regional level and the regional trade facilitation strategy, which, as we know, the Pacific Trade Ministers adopted this week. So again, that is a nice structure that works in the Pacific and it is something that can also apply to other regions. We've found that a regional trade facilitation strategy can leverage economies of scale, particularly in regions where there are a number of smaller countries. And just the last thing that I want to emphasize is the role of the National Trade Facilitation Committee in coordinating communications. So fact sheets, getting them out there, in advance so that the stakeholders will know, kind of how to activate or connect, particularly when there's no communications, the internet cable's been cut, etc. I'll leave it there, but thank you, Alan.
Thank you very much, Bill, for that response. I see Costa Rica has their flag up. Costa Rica.
Muchas gracias, Alan.
Thank you very much, Alan, and thank you to the United States for coordinating and leading this panel. In Costa Rica, we have a National Emergency Commission which centralizes efforts in this regard. However, given the experience of COVID-19, as well as one particular disruption, a cyber disruption that occurred with our customs service last year, we realized that perhaps we had not yet contemplated all the possibilities, all the contingencies that may affect our border services that will have an impact in business continuity for trade. So the National Trade Facilitation Committee agreed that it was necessary to draft contingency plans for other types of situations that could affect our service. And Costa Rica, through our committee, also has local trade facilitation committees in each of our border posts, maritime, air, and land. We then conducted an exercise by which it is the local trade facilitation committees who develop their own contingency plans, taking into consideration differences they might have with other border posts in those situations that they have greater exposure to. For example, for land borders, it is common that if there are any local conflicts, there may be road closings, for instance, something that simple. So each type of border post has a different exposure. And this exercise then allowed us to identify these local contingency risks and then to issue their respective plans. And for domestic authorities, national authorities to draft their national plan, but the national plan has to take on board the specificities of border posts.
This process is currently being implemented. We don't have the results yet, but we hope that it will help us be prepared for the different contingencies which could have an impact on foreign trade.
Great. Thank you very much, Costa Rica. Really interesting point of that your National Trade Facilitation Committee is starting to draft contingency plans that hadn't been envisioned before. Maybe there's an opportunity to talk to the African Development Bank that is contemplating how to integrate some of these together. So maybe that's an opportunity to go have a Zoom call. Nigeria.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Well, let me start with commending all the presenters for the wonderful presentation. And I want to stress that I think, Bill, when you were making your presentation, you emphasized the importance of regional approach, which is very key. And while listening to the presentation by Kenya, I could really see that greatly on the issue of transit. So I want to us to look at it from the angle of the issue of transit again generally, because apart from what I heard from Kenya, I did not hear any arrangement on the issue of transit. And in terms of disaster, not only medicaments, at times even food becomes very, expedited shipment. And there are situations where you see imports crossing from more than 2 to 3 countries. Issue of guarantees. Won't there be any regional arrangement that will cover this thing to ensure that the movement is really an expedited one? And also to African Development Bank, I also listened to what you said, and you also mentioned a window for I think infrastructure support. So these are areas also that we would like to appeal again when it comes to issue of disaster, because some of these LDC countries, even the vaccines that we're talking about that are really perishable, they have difficulties in terms of cold chain or whatever that will even maintain the movement of the vaccines even at the ports or or the points of entry. So all these are areas that I would really love to see African Development Bank looking at. Most of these are LDCs countries, since you mentioned your own window on the issue of infrastructure support. However, I also want to appeal generally on the last recommendation or question by Ecuador. It is important to have a defined role of the National Trade Facilitation Committee when it comes to disaster management. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for that. That intervention, Nigeria, a good point about having a defined and specific role for the NTFC in a disaster context. Niger.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président de séance.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
La semaine sur la question des échanges organisée par l'Organisation
mondiale. And this Trade Facilitation Week organized by the World Trade Organization, the United States has organized this session that allows all stakeholders who are involved in trade facilitation, in particular national trade facilitation committees, to participate and have a discussion. I'd really like to congratulate you for these questions that have been raised here by yourself and by some of the speakers as well. This has enabled us to mobilize the attention of all of us here who are involved in trade facilitation about who does what or who should do what. In particular, we've talked about the role, the link between national trade facilitation committees and emergency committees on these particular issues. And the implementation of provisions that are specifically related to emergency and disasters. And sometimes these issues arise without us being aware of them. Now, in the framework of the discussions between the World Trade Organization and Trade Facilitation and the countries that have put in place their national trade facilitation committees or even regional trade facilitation committees that have been put in place in certain places. We've had discussion on the guidelines by the World Trade to help to categorize our different measures in categories A, B, and C. In particular, category C measures, where the national committees have clearly indicated that they require technical assistance, financial assistance, and capacity building to be able to implement those measures. And in each country, we have to find a way to implement these measures. The way to implement these measures, the entry point is through the national facilitation committees. And I would like to take this opportunity to launch an appeal to the WTO's Trade Facilitation Committee that whenever the opportunity presents itself, please speak to the authorities of the different countries about the commitments that have been made, commitments that are included in in this agreement, article by article, where we have worked to identify which measures fall into which category, where we've worked to identify the required reforms and the activities that will enable us to respect the commitments that we have made and have notified these to the WTO. I'd also have a comment to make, maybe for further reflection. It's a question of indicators that could help us to assess whether the reform activities that are being carried out are going in the right direction. We have to have some sort of indicators to assess the changes that have actually been implemented in terms of simplifying procedures, facilitating procedures, reducing the costs of operations and reducing the duration of procedures and going in the direction of trade facilitation. And I think the Trade Facilitation Committee should think about having some sort of standardized indicators that can be applied to all countries and their national trade facilitation committees, or even to regional trade facilitation committees, to assess the effects of their work. This is what I wanted to raise for the WTO's TF committee. I also have a question for Yusuf. In his intervention, he focused on the CIMAC area, since the African Development Bank has had these interventions within the CIMAC region. But we also have the ECOWAS region, we have the Northern African region, and I didn't hear any mention of any activities of the AFDB in these regions. Unfortunately, he did refer to phase 2 of the African Development Bank's projects, but since we've been able to come here and have more direct contact between countries and donors, it would be good to know what kind of commitments are being made by these different donor institutions in the area of the areas where countries have needs that have been presented to the Trade Facilitation Committee. What kind of commitments can these donors make with respect to our countries? Thank you.
I think we understand the question, and I think I'm going to put you in touch with Yusuf directly after this panel. Those are some excellent questions that are, I think, very broad. You've made an excellent intervention. But I think that in the interest of time, we're going to move to wrap up. But I think that that's a great question that we can pose to Yusuf maybe directly after this panel, just in the interest of time. I want to thank those of you who have intervened. I believe the DRC and Mali also have their flags up. If we could just maybe make a couple relatively short interventions so we can wrap up on time. Thank you. I invite the DRC.
Okay, merci. Merci pour la parole. Thank you for giving me the floor. Allow me to commend the United States for organizing this panel discussion, and I'd also like to commend the African Development Bank for its intervention in our region with CIMAC and the DRC. The National Trade Facilitation Committee is in charge of ensuring coordinating at national level of all activities related to implementing the TFA, in particular the area of appropriate reforms and adjustments that are needed to meet the objectives of the agreement. In the light of the discussions, I feel that the ADB will be able to continue to provide its support. The ADB has already supported our National Trade Facilitation Committee and the Regional Economic Committee. Thank you.
Thank you. Molly?
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair.
À la suite de mes prédécesseurs,
Like my predecessors, I'd like to warmly welcome this initiative taken by the United States to organize this panel discussion. Humanitarian assistance is a vital question for many countries that are affected by various factors of vulnerability. In summary, I'd just like to say that we have to make a distinction between two cases: emergency humanitarian assistance and non-emergency humanitarian assistance. For example, we know that in case of drought, there comes a time where there is a need for humanitarian food aid in a country. And so for countries that are regularly affected by drought or regularly affected by flooding, there is a need to have measures put in place to anticipate and respond to such situations. In our sub-region, the ECOWAS sub-region, ECOWAS itself has an emergency plan and has put in place emergency security food stocks in certain parts of the region. In Mali, we do have such an emergency food stock which is housed in the country, and as needed, the country will, of course, put no impediment in place of the distribution of these emergency stocks. This is part of their agreement to be able to have these stocks in our country. Now, at national level, with the assistance of the UNDP, Mali has drafted an emergency plan. This emergency plan is coordinated by the Ministry of Security and Civil Defense, Ministry of Health, and the Ministry in charge of local administration. The texts governing trade in Mali, whether it's the customs code or other regulations and laws that govern external trade, all provide for humanitarian assistance when an organization wishes to import humanitarian aid. We have specific rules that govern that. Now, to refer specifically to the National Trade Facilitation Committee, I must be frank here and say that the committee, although the committee has been set up in 2019, we've never examined the question of emergency response. But the committee could intervene to help to ensure smooth transport of such goods. For customs, there is no obstacle. But in the case of cooperation with other countries where the assistance should go through the ports or through the borders, that is where we feel that the National Committee could be involved. But even there, as some have said before me, there is a need for collaboration amongst the various National Trade Facilitation Committees in order to facilitate this transport through the various corridors. Before I conclude, I'd like to highlight one point. Humanitarian organizations themselves must also try to anticipate these situations. Today, we've had enough information, and we know that thanks to science, it's possible to know ahead of time where there are risks of earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, where there's regular flooding. Measures need to be taken ahead of time so that when such emergencies suddenly occur, humanitarian aid can be be sent rapidly to such areas. We mustn't wait for the emergency to occur to start mobilizing resources and start determining how we're going to send the humanitarian aid. If we have a mapping of these different possible areas of disaster, it is possible to reduce the risk of loss of human lives. Now, and where it is not possible to foresee everything, we believe that we can still improve forecasts. In Africa, in West Africa, in the Sahel, we know that there are two major risks: drought and flooding when there is excessive rainfall. And there's also the question of conflict, displaced populations due to war. These are the two major risks that need to be taken into account. And if organizations were involved more, I'm sure that we could minimize the impact on the populations. This is what I had to say, Chair. Thank you once again to the United States for having organized this session. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Molly, for providing those perspectives and your experience. You're hearing a common theme of, the need to anticipate and prepare. So we have just a few minutes left. I think we've had a really rich discussion, some really interesting points made by our panelists, and some great interventions and experience sharing and perspectives from the floor. And so very much appreciate the interactivity of today's, this morning's session. Maybe just to wrap up, I got a crazy amount of notes. I don't even know how to make sense of it all, but I think, we have heard some common themes. Coordination, the importance of coordination and communication. I just mentioned anticipating, preparation, having something in place before a disaster strikes. We heard a little bit about the time horizon, that the investing in the upfront costs, not really knowing when you're going to need these systems in place and having to balance kind of finite resources, right? Compared to the need to have something in place. The need to integrate disaster preparedness into your trade facilitation plans, or maybe it's vice versa, and bringing on board important ministries like the Ministry of Health into that planning process. Heard a lot about the role of national trade facilitation committees and how they work and how they interact within broader emergency preparedness plans. As far as next steps, what we intend to do, like we've done in past sessions, is we're going to take everything that we've learned for the United States. We intend to circulate a communication in the Trade Facilitation Committee. So we have an opportunity to have this information memorialized and on the formal record. We would like to consider future sessions. What more can we learn? What more can we drill down on with interested partners? So we very much welcome future collaboration with all of you. And again, the ultimate goal here is it just doesn't go off into the ether and nothing happens with this information. We would like to see how we can take these ideas and concepts and turn them into lessons learned and perhaps best practices, and then act on, right? That's the whole goal of this exercise, is to actually do something with this information. And so those are just a few summary points about today and next steps. I would like to thank all of our speakers. We have, again, Jamie from the Inter-American Development Bank online, Youssef Cohn from the African Development Bank Group, and Kanya Sasra de Boera, pardon my butchering of your last name, from the Asian Development Bank. Bill Gain from the World Bank, John David from UNCTAD. Thank you for your participation. Thank you for your participation. I'm glad to take advantage of your presence, and I hope you've had a very enriching trade facilitation week here in Geneva. Before turning it over to Ambassador Pagan for any final concluding remarks, we'd like to once again thank the interpreters for the great job they have done for us today. Over to you, Ambassador Pagan.
Well, thank you, Alan. And I think you captured some of the thoughts that I had. This has been a fascinating presentation by all the panelists, so thank you. I jotted down a lot of points I would like to make, but I'm going to pick up on actually the point or the question that John had made about how do you justify taking these actions when you would hope that you would never need them, but that's the point, is that you never know when you're going to need them, and that it's preparedness. And I think that this conversation has demonstrated, how important it is to be prepared, and that one of the things that jumped out at me is, the interagency cooperation that it requires at home, but the regional cooperation. I'm thinking also, I think it may have been mentioned, landlocked countries that may need to, really cooperate with their neighbors when they rely on passage, through somebody else's territory. But just even if it's just an island, I am from Puerto Rico, which is an island that has been subjected to many hurricanes, sadly, over the past years. So I do know, from my family's experience, because I've been in the States, how desperate it can be when you need to rely on things getting to you from far away. So I do think that the answer to your question, I hope, is that everybody recognizes how important it is. But to pick up on something that I may have been Mali that alluded to this, that while you need to be prepared for a disaster, and that's very important, there are also lessons that can be used for just regular trade. And I think that, it was mentioned, even just, sometimes you just need, for food security issues, we've been having a lot of conversations here at the WTO on that, sometimes tied to disasters, but sometimes just an evolution of circumstances. So I do think that, and I do hope that we have more conversations like this, and that, I was thinking, I spend a lot of time here hearing people say how dysfunctional the WTO is and how it doesn't work, but the work that is being done in this committee, and thank you, Chair, demonstrates the value of the WTO and the WTO agreements, and the full implementation and effective implementation of the TFA cannot be more practical and key for so many aspects of life. And I think we lose sight of that. And I do hope that people go home and proselytize, because there is a lot of good work being done here that is actually, meaningful and truly helpful. So thank you, because it's been really fascinating to be here. And thank you to the interpreters, and everybody go have lunch.